Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's beg. The Puppeteer. Vitaliy Parks was a man who lived on the outskirts, in a small, remote town in the western part of America. His home was far from everything, on an old farm where the winds played with ancient trees, and the night was so dark that one could lose their bearings. The town where he lived rarely attracted attention. Small shops, old streets, hiding a few dilapidated buildings. But something dark lay behind the silence. Vitaliy was a renowned puppeteer. His works were incredibly detailed, almost lifelike. His puppets stood in shops on displays, drawing gazes with their expressive, nearly human faces. But most people did not know the true nature of these puppets. No one suspected that each creation was made not just of wood or fabric, but of parts of human bodies. There was an old legend about Vitaliy Parks, the puppeteer who created his puppets from victims he caught, luring them to his home. These victims would usually disappear without a trace, and there was nothing suspicious about their disappearances. The search always ended in vain. It was only after many years, when it seemed everything had been forgotten, that strange discoveries began to emerge. Puppets with suspiciously human features, with twisted smiles, and overly realistic eyes that made the skin tremble. One evening, when the moon stood full in the sky, the small town was overcome with anxiety. Another young girl, Sandra, had disappeared. She was a simple university student who had come to visit her family for the holidays. Her disappearance was almost perfect: an empty room, a broken window, and no trace. Everyone went out to search for her, but there was no sign or clue anywhere. The police began an investigation, but their leads pointed to the same house of Vitaliy Parks. The town started whispering about his possible involvement. Everyone knew he loved spending time on his farm, alone and secluded. And no matter how hard they tried to find evidence, they couldn't find anything to confirm their suspicions. But the town could not let go of this thought. Sandra wasn't the first to disappear, and perhaps not the last. And when the locals realized the disappearances weren't accidental, they began searching for something they hadn't noticed before, clues that might point to a horrific truth. Then, one of the residents, Eliza, accidentally saw something in Vitaliy's yard that made her stop in shock. The dim light of the moon reflected off something that looked like a strange puppet left in the yard. It resembled a human but looked somewhat damaged, a broken arm, a crooked mouth. But this wasn't a puppet made of traditional materials. Eliza approached and saw something that took her breath away. It was a puppet, but not an ordinary one. It looked alive. Its features were so realistic that Eliza felt her heart race. Here, before her, stood a piece of what Vitaliy had created. The puppet was made of human skin. And this wasn't just a material for an artwork. It was a living body, one he had captured and turned into a monster. Without hesitation, Eliza ran to the police station. But she knew it might be too late. After all, who knows how many more such terrifying puppets were in Parks' house. The police set off for the farm. Vitaliy Parks greeted them in his usual style, calm, smiling. He denied all accusations, claiming his puppets were simply art. But he made one mistake: he hadn't accounted for the darkness that followed him. That evening, they entered his house, and what they found inside left them speechless. Every room was filled with puppets staring at them with lifelike eyes. And in one room lay Sandra, her body transformed into a new puppet. Her hair was styled in a perfect coiffure, and her face was too lifelike to be real. Vitaliy Parks was arrested, but his story was far from over. For in truth, he wasn't the only one with dark secrets. And as the first witnesses vanished, the puppeteer's shadow began to creep back into the town. When Vitaliy Parks was taken into custody, the town seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. People began to slowly forget about his horrific craft, and for a time, the streets fell silent once more. However, a lingering anxiety remained in their hearts. No one could explain why Parks had begun creating his puppets in such a way. What had driven him to turn living people into soulless objects for his art? And most importantly, how had he managed to operate for so long without drawing attention? On the day that Vitaliy was taken to prison, the police searched his farm, but they found nothing that could shed more light on his dark activities. All they discovered were the same puppets he had created over the years of his obsession. Each of them was crafted with such skill that even an experienced specialist would not immediately recognize the human features embedded within them. It was as though Vitaliy had poured a part of himself into each one. Every puppet was not just an object, but a piece of art with a special history. But what most surprised the investigators was that among the puppets, there were no old ones. The puppets were new, created no more than a few months ago. Vitaliy had not stopped, even when he was suspected. This made them wonder if perhaps he was not alone in his sick activity. It seemed that, by capturing the puppeteer, they had solved all the mysteries. But one question remained unanswered. If this man had truly been involved in the terrible events, why hadn't his arrest led to the destruction of the puppets? Why did they continue to exist in the dark corners of his house, as if waiting for someone to start examining them again? Months passed. The town came to terms with what had happened. Vitaliy Parks was in prison, and it seemed that the problem had been resolved. But one evening, as the town again fell into darkness, one of the puppets, which had seemingly been discarded after the search, reappeared on the doorstep of a house. This time, it was different. The puppet resembled a woman who had recently disappeared. It was Sandra, but her expression was terrifying, her smile slightly twisted. This was impossible. How could this happen? Vitaliy's puppets didn't have the power to come to life. But this was only the beginning. On the night when the puppet began to move again, the town was plunged into darkness. The puppet, which looked like Sandra, began to involuntarily search for windows, following every movement. Those who saw her insisted that she looked into their eyes as if she were truly human. Mysteriously, but it was true. The puppet wasn't just standing, it was trying to say something. And then everything changed. The puppet began to smile. And this was no longer a smile created by the master. It was a smile twisted by terror. The puppet began to move on its own, as though returning to life. And from it emanated some mysterious force that once again filled the town with fear. Everyone thought it was just a nightmare, but within a few days, people began disappearing again. Those who walked the dark streets at night never returned. And in the morning, when the police began searching for the missing, they again stumbled upon the same puppets. Puppets that seemed to show signs of life. Anyone who looked at them felt a chill run down their spine. And when someone decided to destroy one of them, the puppet would suddenly come to life, open its eyes, and try to escape again. Thus began a new era for the town. Vitaliy Parks' puppets became not just static works of art. They became something more, something that couldn't be stopped. The puppeteer was no longer the only prisoner of this tyranny. And though Vitaliy Parks still sat in prison, his dark legacy remained alive. And what was most frightening was that now there were new puppets, bearing the marks of his victims. Was he merely an executor, or had the puppets begun to live their own lives? The answer to that question could only be found in the darkness that filled every night of the town. The town was no longer what it once was. The streets grew empty after sunset, and every resident looked into the darkness with fear. Vitaliy Parks' puppets, which had once seemed like simple pieces of art, had turned into terrifying creatures that haunted their creators. Each puppet found now carried some part of the missing people, fragments of their bodies that came to life in these monsters. Meanwhile, Vitaliy remained in prison, but his obsession showed no sign of stopping. He refused to admit his guilt and even threatened those who tried to interrogate him. He insisted that his puppets were not mere objects, but his children, his creations, and he had every right to them. Despite the police and the courts labeling him as a sick man, fear still gripped the heart of every citizen. Recently, another victim had disappeared, local Dr. Charles Henson, who vanished right from his home. After that, new puppets started appearing, seemingly perfect, but with scars on their bodies that could not be explained. The puppets were beautifully made, but their facial expressions revealed incredible pain, as if they had witnessed something that shattered their spirits. Eliza, the same woman who had first noticed the puppet in Vitaliy Parks' yard, had now become part of a volunteer group assisting the police in searching for the missing. But her fear only grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that the puppets were watching her. She tried to convince her friends that this was no mere coincidence. The town had become a cursed place where the puppets truly embodied the horrors of their creators. One evening, when Eliza returned home late, she noticed a strange light in one of the windows of Vitaliy's farm. That house, long surrounded by police, had once again become the subject of whispers. This time, she saw a figure moving in the window, Someone or something. Unable to endure the anxiety, Eliza decided to return to the house. What awaited her, she didn't know, but an inner urge drove her forward. As she approached the farm, she saw that the doors, which had been locked, were now wide open. Vitaliy Parks wasn't supposed to be allowed out of prison, but his presence on the farm was undeniable. All the windows were darkened, and the doors stood open, as if inviting her into the darkness. Was this a trap? Or was it just another deception in this terrifying place? Gathering all her courage, Eliza stepped inside. She tread carefully on the old wooden floor, which creaked under her weight. A few steps in, she found herself in a room where she had once seen the puppet that resembled Sandra. She now saw many such puppets, dozens, hundreds, scattered throughout the house. But they no longer looked like ordinary toys. They were alive, or at least resembled something human. Something was wrong here. All the puppets she saw now stood motionless, and among them she noticed one, a woman with an expression of terrible agony on her face. She wasn't like the others. This was the puppet that had once been Sandra, but her face was alive again. "Eliza," she whispered, as if the puppet itself was trying to speak. Eliza froze in terror. It felt like this wasn't just mechanical movement. She could sense that this puppet could still feel. It was alive, and this creature seemed to be seeking her help. At that moment, the other puppets began to move. Eliza stepped back, but before she could take another step, the door slammed shut behind her. The ones lurking in the dark corners began to approach her, slowly, silently. Something was terribly wrong with these puppets. They weren't just moving, they were beginning to express human emotions. And then, from the darkness, a voice appeared. It wasn't Vitaliy's voice. It was a deep, trembling whisper that enveloped everything. "They are coming back. I created them, but they cannot leave me." And this was only the beginning. Eliza stood at the center of the room, engulfed in complete darkness, surrounded by the moving puppets, which no longer appeared as soulless works of art, but as beings with their own will. They all seemed tethered to this place, to Vitaliy Parks' house, and now their faces, still strikingly realistic, were marred, reflecting pain and fear. Each puppet bore its own expression, mixing human emotion with mechanical rigidity. One of them, resembling a middle-aged man, stared at Eliza with empty eyes that radiated despair. Another, resembling a young woman, had her eyes wide open, as if she were in a constant state of shock. But none of them looked as they once had, as simple objects for a craftsman's hands. Eliza felt the air growing thicker. Her heart began to race, and she knew that if she stayed here for even another minute, these puppets would begin to act like they once had under Vitaliy's influence. They were no longer mere fragments of the past, they were its continuation, and now this tyranny was part of her reality. She took a few steps backward, trying to avoid coming into contact with the puppets. But as soon as her foot brushed against the wood on the floor, one of the puppets took a step forward. And it wasn't the movement of a mechanical object. This puppet began to move as if it were a living being. It drew closer to Eliza, its appearance shifting with each step, as if powered by the same terrifying force that had sustained this mad creation. You must help," the puppet whispered, its voice so real that Eliza gasped in terror. She wanted to scream, to ask what was happening, but her voice was trapped. The puppet moved so close that its cold, worn body brushed against her hand. And that's when Eliza realized, this wasn't just a horrifying creation of Vitaliy's. This was something more. These were souls trapped within their bodies, and they yearned for release. The doors behind her suddenly swung open, and Eliza turned her head. In the doorway stood someone, a figure resembling Vitaliy. But this wasn't him. This was merely his echo, a body that had remained after his arrest. "They can't leave me," the figure spoke again, the dark echo of his voice. Vitaliy was in prison, but in his voice, in his eyes, there was something else. Malice, a thirst for power that existed beyond the physical body. He was no longer just a man who made puppets. He had become something else, something that controlled them. Eliza stood frozen, her mind struggling to understand what was happening. Vitaliy Parks couldn't be here. But the figure standing before her was undeniable. He controlled the puppets even from beyond his physical form. "They are coming to life," whispered the puppet standing before her. "They are looking for themselves, searching for their creator." In that moment, Eliza understood that this wasn't just Vitaly's mania, not just a desire to create perfect works of art. He wasn't merely claiming the lives of his victims. He was using their souls to build his own army. And these puppets, they had become his curse. They lived, even though they had no bodies. But what was most terrifying was that the puppets no longer had Vitaly's control. They acted on their own volition. They were free. Now they were part of something greater, and Eliza could only watch as it all spiraled into darker depths. "You must accept this," the puppet standing before her said. "You are part of this. You cannot choose. Vitaliy made us, and now we will not leave you." The mysterious voice sounded again, and she realized that her past and future were merging into this shared dark reality. All these puppets weren't merely his creations. They were made to leave a mark on the world, and now they were coming for her. And at that moment, as the darkness filled the room, Eliza knew that nothing could ever be called normal again. The puppets were alive, and they had broken free from control. Now, even though Vitaliy Parks remained in prison, he was no longer the main force. The puppets had become self-sustaining beings, and they wouldn't stop until they achieved their goal. The town remained in shadow, and no one knew who would be the next victim. In the darkness, Eliza stood frozen, watching as the puppets began to move. They no longer remained still like soulless objects. They were alive, or almost alive. Their faces twisted, their movements grew increasingly chaotic, and every sound that escaped their lips resembled muffled screams. "You can't escape us," whispered the puppet standing next to her, its voice sounding like the rustling of ancient trees, but with something human in it, an echo of pain, of suffering that refused to fade. Eliza felt panic rising inside her. Her heart raced, every step backward tightening her chest. She knew that if she stopped even for a moment, the puppets would come alive again, and they would start to chase her. Her hands trembled as she tried to find a way to the door, but these horrible, terrifying creatures had already surrounded her from every side. The puppets, which once looked like ordinary people, were no longer just creations of Vitaliy. They had become something greater. They had become his embodiment. "They want more," said the puppet that resembled a young woman, her face pale, her eyes merciless. "They want to replace us. And you will be a part of them." Eliza felt her blood freeze. She wasn't just a witness to this. She had become part of this nightmare. What else was left for her? Did she still have a chance to escape? And then she heard something even more terrifying, a low sound coming from deep within the house. It wasn't just an echo. It was as if something enormous and invisible was moving through the rooms, tearing the space around it. "Vitaliy! Vitaliy!" It was a whisper that echoed from all sides. It grew clearer and louder. She could feel his presence again, as though he was here, between her and the puppets. "Vitaliy Parks, he's still here," a new voice sounded. It was familiar, cold, and remorseless. This wasn't just the voice of a puppet. This was Vitaliy himself. And it wasn't his physical presence. It was his spirit, living in each of these creatures. Eliza took several steps back, her eyes darting in search of an escape, but once again, a figure appeared in the doorway. Vitaliy, though imprisoned, looked different. He was like a shadow, straightening itself from the darkness. His hands were wrapped in horrific threads, and the same threads began appearing on the puppet's hands as they started to gather toward him. "You can't stop me," roared Vitaliy, his voice trembling with sinister power. "They are all mine. I created them. I'll create more. And you too will become part of this, Eliza." The threads began to wrap around her, twisting like living things. These weren't just threads. They were something alive, tearing into her body, merging her with other victims who had become part of this nightmare. Her blood froze as this otherworldly entity began to coil around her. The threads intertwined with her skin, her blood, her existence. She felt her soul being absorbed into this darkness, knowing that her fate would become another piece of the terrifying collection living among the puppets. "You can't escape me. I live in every puppet. I live in you," Vitaliy whispered, and his figure became more and more tangible. No longer just a shadow, he had become his own reality. Vitaliy's body, though imprisoned, had become part of every puppet, every thread that bound them. They had all become one. And then, as in a nightmare, Eliza understood. Vitaliy wasn't just a master of puppets. He had become them, and they all lived now only to create more like them. Nothing could stop this endless creation of terror. The town, once peaceful, had become a wasteland. And when people tried to escape this horrific cycle, they became part of it, just like Eliza. Vitaliy Parks and his puppets had become part of a new world where every soul was melted into terror. And they would keep creating and creating, until everything became part of their endless nightmare. It was the end for everyone. Those who survived were left in the darkness, where there was no place for peace. Vitaliy Parks was no longer just a man. He was, and would always remain, the one who controlled the dolls, and they would never stop. The darkness became even thicker. Eliza couldn't breathe. Her consciousness seemed to shatter, turning into phantom images swirling around her, like shadows from another world. She felt her body no longer obeying her, as the threads piercing her skin pulled her deeper into the abyss. She was no longer just part of this nightmare. She had become part of Vitaliy, and the pain was unbearable. This wasn't the pain of physical injury. It was the feeling that parts of her soul were starting to detach and join something terrifying and eternal. "You're losing yourself," whispered one of the dolls, approaching her. Her face was that of a woman, but her expressions were twisted into such horrific figures that they seemed like caricatures of human emotions. "You will never be yourself again." Eliza couldn't respond. Her mouth was blocked, the threads leaving no room for thoughts. She felt her very essence begin to dissolve, disappearing into the darkness, into the world of dolls. Vitaliy Parks stood there, in the dark corner, his hands not just pulling threads, they were controlling everything happening around them. "They want you," he said, his voice dull, emotionless, like the echo of hell itself. "You will become one of them. Your soul will be my doll. And no one will save you." Eliza saw the threads starting to pull parts of herself from her body. These weren't just physical changes. They were penetrating her memory, her experiences, taking everything that once made her human. She saw her memories, like frames from an old film, now tearing apart. Every memory, every moment when she was alive, was becoming part of these dolls, part of this twisted reality. "There's nothing left of you, Eliza." Vitaliy took a step forward, his figure becoming blurry, but there was a dark power in his movements. A coldness emanated from him that made it impossible to warm her soul. "They all want you. This is your fate. And now you'll be with me forever." Vitaliy looked at her as if she were just another part of his collection. But in his eyes, there was not just anger. It was hatred, awakening in him with each new creation, with every new doll he made. He didn't just crave power. He was sick with the desire to dominate. And these dolls had become his curse. And then, when Eliza had almost lost herself, she felt something, a strange pressure in her chest, as if a part of her still remained unbroken. She once again saw in her memory images that once seemed undeniably lost. Her childhood, her parents, the faces of her friends. These images were now in danger of disappearing forever. But then, at the darkest moment, when it seemed everything was lost, Eliza felt one thing. She had not been completely consumed. She still had a chance. Vitaliy seemed to not notice the changes happening with her body. He was consumed with his own desire to possess her, to turn her into yet another part of his doll collection. All his thoughts were focused on taking her completely. "You are mine," he whispered again. But now there was a note of hesitation in his voice, something that hadn't been there before. "You'll be my last doll." But suddenly something happened. Eliza felt an invisible force leaving her soul. It wasn't just her will. It was something hidden from her, some ancient, buried instinct to fight, one she couldn't understand but felt in every cell of her body. Her thoughts became clearer. She was no longer just a victim. She was something more. "I will not be your doll," she said, her voice clear and loud, like an explosion. Vitaliy took a step back. This was impossible. The doll who was created to become part of him, she had become human again. And that was dangerous. It was unpredictable. "You can't escape." Vitaliy drew a knife, one of those he once used to create his dolls. His movements became swift, like the dolls. But now he was not just a master. He was a predator. But at that very moment, Eliza grabbed his hand. She felt the threads holding her start to tear, as her body, even through the pain, became independent. She wasn't just pulling the threads, she began turning them into a weapon. And this moment became the last in all of Vitaly's history. He tried to pull the knife out, but his movements became slow. The dolls no longer obeyed him. Vitaliy, who had once been the master of this horrifying reality, had now become its victim. In the end, he fell. But the dolls he had created were still alive. And now they looked at Eliza, as if waiting for her next move. "It's not over yet," came the final whisper, and the remaining dolls began to move. Vitaliy was dead, but his creations continued to live. Thus ended Eliza's struggle. But even when it seemed that she had won, the dolls did not disappear. They remained in the darkness, living their own, terrifying life. And while some believed that it was all over, others knew that the nightmare was just beginning. Eliza stood amidst the ruins of the terrible world that Vitaliy had created. His lifeless body lay mercilessly on the floor, but the dolls, as if extracting the last fragments of life from him, did not retreat. They remained here, inside this house, where everything looked like an illusion, a dreadful trap. Vitaly's shadow continued to hang in the air, like a ghost that could not leave this place. And although his physical body was destroyed, his creations had their own will, their own independence, which he had never foreseen. The dolls moved toward her, their faces blending with the faces of their victims, and every one of their movements was filled with an invisible purpose. "You thought you could stop this?" The voice of one of the dolls, resembling a little girl, was heard. Her eyes glowed with a cold light, and her smile was nothing but a grotesque distortion. "This is only the beginning." Eliza couldn't breathe. Her consciousness felt the darkness swallowing her again, even though she thought she had won. But victory was just an illusion. She realized she couldn't destroy these dolls, no matter how hard she tried. They were not just objects. They had become parts of an immortal entity that Vitaliy had created. And if one of them fell, another always rose. "I created them, and they will live forever," another doll spoke, this time a male-like voice. "You won't be able to stop them. You are only a temporary part of this cycle." Eliza no longer had the strength to fight. Her heart was beating weaker, but she still had one last hope. She couldn't let them achieve complete victory. She had only one option left: to escape this place. Feeling that every step took her deeper into this endless labyrinth, she saw an empty door leading into the darkness. She knew it was her only chance to flee, though she understood that it might only be a temporary postponement of her end. Meanwhile, the dolls were drawing closer. They moved faster, their eyes glowing in the dark, like predatory beasts. They all, like maniacs, reached out for her to take her completely. They had become part of this house, part of this darkness. And now, it was only a matter of time. She made one last sprint. Her hands trembled, but she didn't stop. Each step was her final chance. She could feel the darkness retreating, but even in the dark tunnel, these steps didn't bring a sense of relief. Vitaliy was dead, but his legacy was here, in these dolls, in this darkness. But when she finally reached the door, something unexpected happened. The dolls stopped. Their eyes no longer glowed. Their movements slowed to a minimum, and only the wind sang its song through the empty house. They became static. And then, just before the door, Eliza felt everything around her begin to disintegrate. "You are leaving," a voice said, seemingly coming from the very essence of the house. It was Vitaly's voice, but not the one she knew. It was only his soul, which remained in the dolls. And then, at the very moment when she tried to open the door, she felt her own body stop obeying her. She was no longer just a human, but a part of this dreadful machine, this cycle that never stopped. The dolls remained in their eternal darkness, waiting to rise again and fill this world. Vitaliy Parks, though dead, became part of this invisible world that would never end. And everyone who stepped into this place would become a new doll in this relentless cycle that lasted forever. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows. They are always near. Until next time.